Hi, Rod Fleming in the Philippines here, and we're going to do a piece today about the death of democracy, which is quite important. Once I've done this initial piece, which will be relatively short, I will prepare a longer discussion piece, which will go on Patreon, possibly onto my members channel on YouTube also. We'll just see how that works out. So the basic version will be here. There will be a longer form for members either of Patreon or YouTube, if the YouTube works out. I'm still trying to figure out how to make it work. Anyway, here's the addresses to which you should help us because you know it's worth it. So, today, the death of democracy. Let's have a think about that. I have to have the window open. If you hear some cars going past, I'm just sorry. It's just too hot otherwise. Anyway, the death of democracy. I think the first problem, that is something that we are seeing just now. We are seeing democracy being completely crushed. And the first thing we have to do is to identify this, to find out what on earth is going on, is to try to figure out what democracy actually is. You know, we always think of the Greeks and democracy, and that wasn't really democracy at all, because only a very small number of people were allowed to vote and take part in it, right? It's only the upper class, the nobility effectively, who were allowed to take part in this democracy. So in effect it was a kind of oligarchy rather than democracy. But we have taken the ideas of people like Plato and Aristotle particularly and developed these into modern representative democracies. Now, since the beginning, if you were to take, a good example obviously is the United States and the founding fathers, the writing of the Constitution. It's really important and actually a beautiful document. It's well worth reading. And I think every nation in the world should have that document. But that's another issue, that's just me. But at the time that was written, many people were very, very concerned about the development of political parties. And this was a reasonable concern. The problem is that political parties undermine democracy. I know you think, yeah, democracy, you've got lots of different parties, but by nature, political parties are anti-democratic. And the reason is as follows. If you consider the United Kingdom, which is the one I'm best familiar with, but you'll know, and I've been to many party conferences, but I'm quite sure it's the same in the United States. I don't think there's any substantial difference or substantive distance rather. What happens is that ideas or opinions are put forward at conference. Some will be discussed, and if they are discussed, they'll be voted on. And if they vote yes, then that becomes official party policy and normally would become part of its manifesto. Okay? And that's all internal, that's all inside the party. And let's suppose that you have a motion that everybody has to have white wall tires on their cars, right? And actually, I'll be quite honest with you, that would not be the most ridiculous law or bill that I've ever heard being proposed. You all have to have white wall tires. So there's the party takes it on board, they have a debate, and by 51%, this is passed and becomes official party policy. That if we get into government, then we're going to mandate that everybody must have white wall tires. So then you come to a general election. And let's assume, just for the sake of assumption, that you have one party wins by 51%. In the UK, that never happens. Ruling parties in the UK have usually got somewhere in the middle to higher 30%. Certainly not 51, that would be an absolute landslide. But just suppose that they have 51% of the vote. So what you've got is this party which has already passed a mandate to apply a law that enforces everyone to have white wall tires. So 51% of the party demanded white wall tires, and this party got into power on 51% of the vote. How can this be democratic? Of course it's not democratic. The interests of a small group of people have been amplified and turned into the policy of a national party and then into law by this process that we call democracy. That's not democracy. A real example would be the prevalence of so-called low-energy light bulbs. Nobody asked for those. Nobody. They're terrible. You can't see a damn thing under them. There was never a vote. It just happened. It was done. Another case in Britain would be the Gender Recognition Act, which I support. I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I support the GRA. 2004. There was no debate. It was just passed through. And I think that there were a handful of people, certainly under 10, actually in the House of Commons when the vote came, and it was just put through on a nod. How is that democracy? How does that reflect the will of people? And we're seeing now problems particularly with that act, the GRA, because so many people weren't asked, and now because of the furore, it's really a storm in the latte cup because the numbers are very small. It's being revisited, and people say, "Oh my God, we have this law which we shouldn't have." Well, I think we should have it, but the fact is that the public debate was never held. It didn't happen. That law was just put through on the nod. That's not democratic. So we already have a situation where the function, the mechanism, if you like, the mechanism of democracy is highly dubious and actually quite undemocratic. Right? Now the next problem is that since it's always been a factor. In Britain, for example, we had the general strike in the 1920s, so on and so forth. But since the 1960s, direct action outside of the conventional democratic structures has become a real feature of life in the West. And that includes things like riots, protests. At the moment we've got idiots blocking major motorways, that's expressways, freeways, because, I don't know, they have some ecological complaint. And rather than take it through the democratic process, where they know they would lose, and that's the whole point, they know they would lose. Instead, they cause as much disruption as they can in the hopes that ordinary people will go, oh. Or the government will say, well, it's just going to be easier if we just put through the laws that they want and stuff the rest of the population. I don't think they're going to get away with that particularly. I think that this is going to get a little bit nasty. And in fact, in all honesty, it can't happen quick enough. There is a process. The democratic process may be flawed, but it's still possible for a small group, as we've seen with the white wall tires, to get into politics and achieve its ends without actually having a majority of the people behind it. Now, I think that's wrong, but at the same time, you can't justify causing havoc and widespread, basically anarchy, just because you want things done and you're too damn lazy to go through a process which is skewed in your favour anyway. That's ridiculous. So I think we have a problem. Looking at the situation in Britain and the motorway protests, the police have been completely ineffectual. I don't see British police in riot gear with shields and batons charging these people. I don't see them using tear gas. And they certainly would in France, believe me, they would. I just see people, it's almost like they offer them cups of tea. And to all the honest tax-paying motorists who just want to get home and who are paying the policeman's wages, by the way, stuff you. Oh, no. These people are just sitting there. Well, let's leave them there. It has been appalling. The last week I've seen appalling scenes in Britain because these people know they're going to get away with it. They know that democracy has failed. You see, what you have to understand is this fundamental issue with democracy, which is it depends on consensus, right? The principle behind all democratic systems is that we have the debate, we have the vote, and then we go along with whichever side wins. Okay? So first of all, you have to be invested in the democratic process. You can't work outside it. That's just wrong. That is anarchy. That is just trying to break democracy to get what you want. But the other side is that you agree to agree. That if it goes the way you don't want it to go, you're just going to go along with it. That's the way it's going to be. I mean, we see in the UK and in Scotland, I mean, the SNP is a terrible, terrible institution, and I'm proud Scot, but I'm not proud of these people. You know, I really am not. They demanded, and they got, a referendum on independence in 2014, and they said, this is a once in a generation occurrence. Well, it's hardly 7 years later, and they want another one. Well, 7 years isn't a generation. Normally, a generation is taken to be 25 years. But no. They don't want that. They want to get round it. They're not accepting the consensus. The consensus was, you had the vote, you lost, live with it. They don't want to live with it. And they know that they can cause enough disruption by basically undemocratic behaviour that they hope they might get, what they want is another referendum. And they will keep on at this. They will just keep on at this until maybe one day they win, which would be catastrophic, obviously. Scotland's not capable of survival on its own. Sorry. And I don't care what anybody says. I lived there for a very long time, and I am Scottish, and I'll tell you, no. It won't work. So, democracy at the moment is in a position of grave crisis because elected governments, who didn't really, in many cases, have the will of the people behind them, and this is particularly the case where you have the ridiculous notions of proportional representation and what that causes, where you have parties coming together to form coalition governments. I mean, no, they don't please anybody. That doesn't please anyone. Like Trudeau is the leader of a minority government. How is that democratic? How can that possibly be democratic? He's a man that most people voted against, and yet he's leading the country. And the problem is that this is causing real issues. The Western world in particular has big problems just now. It has problems with immigration, major problem, which is constantly being underplayed in the media. The situation in Europe is now, it's an absolute disaster. Europe has committed collective suicide. It's opened its borders to people who have no understanding of what Europe is about, who don't care about democracy at all. Not at all. Their idea of democracy is we get our party in and then we shut the whole thing down. That's what they think democracy is. And so Europe is dying. It's going to be history within a very short period of time. I think I will see, I'm 65, I think I'll see the final collapse of Europe. And that's a tragedy. Britain might survive as an offshore island for a little bit longer. But for you, those of you who are in America, you need to think about this. The people that you're inviting in their hordes have no interest in maintaining the nation that you've built. They just want to rub it. That's all they want. They just want your money. And they're using techniques which are not democratic to get it. So democracy is in a powerless condition, and we will have more to say about this. So meantime, thank yous and bye-bye.